6'7" defensemen don't grow on trees, especially not those playing top 4 minutes in the KHL. The prospect spotlight is on Anton Silayev for today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects are ready for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Hadi Kalikesh, joined by Sebastian High, and on today's show, we'll be giving the prospect spotlight to Anton Silayev, 6'7" left-handed Russian defenseman who's eligible for the 2024 NHL Draft. He's an April 06 birthday, so as of recording this, he hasn't turned 18 yet. And he's already playing top 4 minutes in the KHL this year, and has been doing pretty well with those minutes. The production's up there, but we'll talk about all that. We'll discuss the puck skills, the overall profile of Silayev, the way he plays in our first segment. In our second, we'll discuss the toolkit, the habits in his game, and then in our final segment, we'll give you an idea of what his projection is and which team would be the best fit. But before we get into any of that, just remember to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day and leave us a rate and review. It helps the channel out a lot. So let's get right into it. As a head scout and head of European scouting, you've watched a lot more of Silayev than I have, but I've still caught a decent amount of games, and I think we have more or less the same idea of Silayev. So talk me through the profile that teams would be getting here in Anton Silayev.
For sure. I mean, obviously the size kind of jumps off the page here at 6'7" and 207 pounds, as he's listed right now. This is a hulking left shot defenseman, and the skating ability is central to all the hype surrounding him. He moves like very few 6'7" people on knife shoes should be able to move, and he has a tremendously powerful lower body. He can close gaps with a single stride and do so at the turn of a dime. He can be really unpredictable with how he closes those gaps, and as a result, transition defending has a really, really high ceiling. And while inconsistency mars his game, and we'll get into the details of that as this episode unfolds, the upside is astronomical. And if he pans out to his ceiling, we could see a player that is the best in the NHL at the couple things he does at an elite level, including transition defending and using his physicality to defend the cycle and clear the net front and win board battles. So those are all massive strengths with Silayev, and the way he's able to move around fluidly and efficiently is central to his projection. But yeah, he's really toolsy, really raw, which is perhaps not what you would expect for a player that has been playing consistent minutes in the KHL all season long. But the KHL is evolving as a league, and we're seeing young and raw players starting to actually play some bigger minutes at the KHL level. And Silayev's one of the key players in that, as an example of that this season.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the upside is certainly central. But from what you've seen so far this season, what makes his profile the style that has certain people ranking him second overall? Like he's second overall on Bob McKenzie's board, which is quite consistently the most representative of where NHL teams stand.
Yeah.
And while we are big fans of the upside, we have enough question marks that he is not inside either of our top eights at the very least, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think the main trait with Salive is obviously the size. I mean, you look at the combination of size and speed, and I think we were talking before recording this, and I'm struggling to name you a player who's as good, who covers as much ice as Anton Silayev in one stride, like even in the NHL. Like there are very few players that can kind of match his ability to close gaps that efficiently and that quickly. Um, like you said, the combination of speed and size, the combination of fluidity and size and skating, that combination you don't see it a lot. But what's really interesting for me is that it really has to do with Salive's body proportions. A lot of bigger, a lot of 6'7" people are a lot taller in the legs or have a really high torso, a really tall torso rather. And with Salive, it feels like his body proportions are almost perfect in order to be able to skate at an efficient level. So the way that he skates, he seems like he skates like a 6'2" player when he's 6'7". He has the same stride speed. He has the same foot speed. He has the same width and depth of stride as players that are much smaller than him. But he's covering more ice than him. He has 5 inches on him. That's 5 inches more with each stride. Like it's absurd what he's able to do with his mobility. Um, so that's why he's showing up like second or third overall in a lot of rankings, including the big ones. But there's also a reason why he shows up as low as 17th overall in some rankings, is that the puck skills are a concern. So talk me through that. The trifecta of puck skills being stick handling, shooting, and passing. Where does he stand on that?
For sure. I think that the handling would be the weakest of that trifecta,
Mhm.
especially when it's closer into his skates. One of the drawbacks with his size is that obviously he uses a really long stick because he's absolutely massive. But when he has to keep the puck closer to his body and when he's pressured and tries to solve problems with his puck handling ability at the KHL level, he really struggles because the puck is just always so far away from his body, and that makes his handling game a bit of a question mark. But when he's just skating forward and has space, he's a decent enough handler. He's not necessarily choppy with how he handles the puck. It's more when he's pressured. The deer in the headlights effect really hits him as a puck carrier specifically, and we see a similar effect in his breakout passing game. When he's pressured, the level of poor decision making really starts spiking, and that's one of my concerns with him specifically, is that the tools are very strong as a whole, especially on the defensive side of things. But when he's pressured or put into uncomfortable positions, it starts to fracture a little bit more. But I think the shot is probably, like, along with the passing, are both like slightly above average in terms of projection. Like, I'd probably give both the shot and the passing a 5.5 grade on our 10-point scale that we use over at Dobber Prospects to assess tools. The shot has a lot of power, but the accuracy still has a little bit of work to do. You can really shoot into shin pads, and while he's definitely learning to uh, really protect possession in the offensive zone and go for more of that pass first approach, especially at the top of an umbrella. He can be quite an effective passer. He's a pretty swift passer. Like, the passes he makes are pacey, and when they're short range, they're quite accurate, which makes him quite effective at the top of an umbrella. That said, it's nothing otherworldly in terms of the passing game. There are some real flashes where he makes some impressive plays with his passing tools, but it's far from a game-breaking skill. And I think that the overall offensive upside is certainly capped by his limited tools in that facet of the game.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the main standout with Salive, and we'll talk a bit more about what the habits surrounding his puck skills do to his puck skills, because I think that's where the main issue is. But in isolation, his shot and his hand and his passing ability are decent. The handling ability really struggles massively because this is a player who the distance from his eyes to the puck is bigger than any other prospect in this draft. Like, that's the main issue, is that he's having to process a game. He's having to compensate for that by trying to process a game at a higher speed, but it's not always working out. And I think the main issue with that is when you've got a player with that much distance between his hands and between his eyes and the puck, you need him to be able to react quickly, but also you need him to be able to handle the puck in ways that minimize the risk of putting it in a bad situation. I think the way Salive handles the puck with his top arm kind of locked to his side and the puck kind of ahead of him rather than to his side in his hip pocket, I think that is for me the biggest concern of his puck skills, right? Because when you've got the puck in your hip pocket, first it's closer to you. You're able to make plays and stride, but you're also more deceptive. And I think that's the main thing that lacks in Salaev's puck skills is deceptiveness. He's pretty linear.
Big time.
But we'll get into the habits, the toolkit, and all that good stuff in our second segment here. We'll discuss that right after these messages from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects.
Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all of your favorite NBA teams and players with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive props, and far more. I know I personally am always a massive fan of going for a big same game parlay just to make the action a little bit more interesting. Before going to a game, I select a couple specific stats or outcomes that I think are going to happen and put them together in one single bet, which just compounds the possible gains, and it makes everything just that much more exciting. Just visit fanduel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA.
Alrighty, so moving on to the toolkit and habits, and this is the part where there's a big divergence between the more higher end scouting lists, the ones that really focus on what NHL teams want, and the ones that really focus on the projectability of a player, the upside of a player. I think this is the area where that difference really stands out. We're more on the end of the difficulty with that area, right? Like I feel like this is an element of Salayev's game that if he can work it out, you can make him a really, really good NHLer. But it's a big ask, right?
It certainly is, especially for a player that is likely going to be drafted in the top 5 or even top 3 of the NHL draft.
Yeah.
He is really raw, and that is really seen in the habits, and we're going to really dig into that in this segment. But it's also one of the reasons that we are personally a bit more skeptical, because Salayev is going to need a decent amount of time before he's ready for NHL hockey, at least in a dependable role where he's not overly insulated.
Yeah.
And if he's drafted at like second or third overall, how frustrated will the organization and fan base get when by year 3 or 3.5 he still isn't even touching the NHL yet because he needs to marinate? Like he's going to have 2 years in the KHL still after this season, before his contract runs out, and I'm expecting at least one more season in the AHL after then, which is a pretty long waiting game for a player that is hyped this high up in draft rankings. And a lot of that comes down to those habits. The panic threshold is a lot lower with Silayev than for any other defenseman that we have ranked in the top 15 this year.
Yeah.
There's a real deer in the headlights effect with him, especially with the puck on his stick, but also the inconsistency between games. Like we've talked about the transition defending, and at his best, he is the best transition defender in this draft class, and it's not even close at all.
Yeah.
But it's not consistent either. There are times where he is way too aggressive and is stepping up near the red line and is just causing odd man rushes against, and other times where he's trying to hold himself back and is overly passive and gives way too big of a gap for the opponent when he really is so capable of closing those aggressively.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a lot of question marks with his projection, because if everything turns out and he's able to like shed a little bit of that wonkiness that he still certainly has at 6'7" and is able to iron out some of those decision making warts that have been quite consistent this season, and then the top pairing upside is quite tangible. But if
Yeah.
that does not happen, what's his floor? Like, in my eyes, it's probably around that of a really frustrating number 4 defenseman at the NHL level because of the habits. And habits are so important, but in an 18-year-old player, that is just how it is. And the fact that he's been playing so much in the KHL is also exposing a lot of those warts a lot more than they would be in the MHL, for instance.
Yeah, for sure. Like that's a big part of it is you're talking about a player who is facing, some of the tougher competition of any prospect in this draft. The players that are playing right now at the pro level, most of them among draft eligibles are playing in bottom 6 roles, are playing in kind of sheltered scenarios. Salai's being thrown to the wolves at times. Like he's on their top penalty kill at times. He's, manning their second power play, playing against some really good penalty killers on at 5-on-5. He's facing top 6 lines. Like that's part of the equation here, right? Is that you're talking about a player who's facing top pros already. But I think the main part of this with Salayev is the toolkit, because the way that his tools interact with his panicky tendency is a big issue. You talked about
Yeah.
the breakout under pressure. Like Salayev would be a much better breakout player if he was, able to handle that pressure, if he was able to stay calm. Because again, his passing in isolation is good. It's an above average tool. His ability to hit players in stride, his ability to kind of kind of settle the puck in his pocket and just kind of rifle it up the ice. His ability to identify which passes to make at what times is really good. But as soon as he gets pressured, it's just pure panic, and he kind of coughs pucks up the boards and throws him up the first outlet he sees. You know, being able to handle that high end pressure is so important, especially once you get to the NHL on smaller ice against harder forecheckers, against more consistent pressure. It's something that he's definitely going to have to work on. But I do give him some leeway because again, he's facing some of the toughest competition in this draft class, and obviously the KHL's level has dropped a decent amount in the last couple of years since what's going on in Ukraine. A lot of players that, a lot of former NHLers, instead of going to the KHL, are gravitating more towards the SHL, the Swiss National League. Those leagues have gotten tougher, and the KHL's level has dropped, which is actually part of what's made Silayev able to make that jump into a KHL top four. But he's still facing pro players on a consistent level, and top six pro players. Like that's not an easy task for a 17-year-old. And the hard part with this is it's hard to see him develop that. It's not something you necessarily develop organically as you go on. This is something that you develop over years and years of hard work and focus and video scouting and all the stuff that NHL teams are able to offer him. But that's part of what makes him promising, is that if he's going to be picked in the top three, his NHL team's going to invest everything in making sure that he hits, right.
Exactly, and I think like this is also like something that I've been thinking about a lot with Celaia's projection specifically is if you were any other profile of player and you had the combination of like just being this raw in the overall toolkit and in the habits and in the decision making with a potential top two, top three selection, I'd be a lot more concerned. But because he is a 6'7" left shot defenseman who skates like the wind, is unbelievably physical, has some tools that only a handful of other human beings on the planet could replicate on the ice, that is really going to help in terms of ensuring that his development isn't neglected. And other profiles of players, like for instance, undersized wingers like the Ivan Demidovs of the world, are a lot less secure in that sense
Yeah.
of having an NHL team that will, through thick and thin, stick by the prospect side. And with Silayev, he has a profile that whichever NHL team drafts him, they are going to invest the house to make sure that he ends up as a big difference maker inside a top four. But I think like another question on that front would be, what would that approach in the development be? Would it be to kind of try to build an offensive game, or would it be doubling down on what is already there? I think I would be very much focused on the latter. I think that the upside offensively is a bit more limited, but that the defensive upside is just astronomical. And while that
Yeah.
isn't the flashiest thing, and the fans of whichever team drafts him might not love hearing that he might be an all defense player at the next level at his best, that is where I think he can make the biggest difference at the NHL level.
Yeah, for me, it's just it's fun. It's funny to say, but I think it's neither. I think the focus should really, really be on just making him less panicky under pressure,
Oh,
because you unlock
of course.
everything,
Yeah.
right?
For
I
sure.
don't think
Panic
like
is the
as
key.
much 100%. Like if you remove that problem from the equation, not only does Salaya's offensive upside double, but his defensive abilities improve a lot as well. Because I think a lot of NHL level defending is a lot like playing poker. It's knowing when to go all in, when to fold, when to call. Um, when you're defending the rush, when you're defending end zone, do you rush to the corner to stop a player from getting the puck? Do you sit back, let the play develop, and identify his pass option? There's a lot of poker in NHL level defending. Silayev is about the worst poker player I've ever seen. Be ranked this high. Like it's a bad part of his game. But if you can get that to even average, or maybe even slightly above average, you can get a fantastic defenseman out of him. Like that's I think the biggest part of this equation is teaching him how to play poker on the ice. Yeah, I mean overall, there's a lot of work to do with Salayev's mental game, but no player has this level of physical tools. And we'll get into the projection with Salayev, and also what team would be the best NHL fit right after these messages from our sponsors here at Locked On NHL Prospects. If you're looking to buy cheap tickets last minute to any event, GameTime is the best place to get that done. I'm someone whose schedule changes around a lot, so I can find myself with an afternoon free out of nowhere, and GameTime's the best place to get last minute tickets, or sometimes an hour after events start. Tickets are still available on GameTime. They're obsessed with saving you money as well, and that's for any event, whether that's sports, theater, comedy, whatever requires tickets. You can get through GameTime, and a bunch of deals on their app help you save money as much as possible. They have zone deals, which are my favorite, where you pick the section and Game Time picks the seat, and that gives you an average of about 18% of savings. And the Game Time guarantee makes sure that you always get the best price for your ticket. If you find a ticket in the same section and row for less than what Game Time has to offer, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. You download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKED ON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, super simple. Just download the app, create an account, and redeem the code Locked On for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Alrighty, so moving on to our final segment, we'll be discussing the projection for Anton Silayev at the NHL level, what we expect him to become, and we'll also talk about what the best NHL fit would be. So let's start with the projection. I think you have a better idea of this than I do, because I still have so many question marks regarding how Silayev projects. I could see him become, a number two, number three defenseman, but I wouldn't say the worst case scenario is a frustrating number four. I think the worst case scenario is alive is a frustrating number five or six. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
But where do you stand
it's
on that?
for sure. I think part of the reason that I see the floor at the as a number four is precisely because I think that his development will absolutely get all the focus of whichever organization drafts him, and they will play him in a top four, whether he should be there or not. And that naturally, I think, will develop into being at least a number four defenseman. If I'm playing it safe, I think 2 or 3 is probably where he will slot in eventually, which is part of the reason why I'm skeptical of drafting him inside that top 3 or top 5 or top 7 range. That's not necessarily the value of player that I'm personally targeting in terms of likelihood of hitting upside. That said, there is definitely upside as a number 1 defenseman in Silayev. I'm not trying to deny that at all. It's just really abstract at this stage in time, and a lot of things would have to break right for that to happen. Uh,
Yeah.
that said, even if he ends up as a number 1 defenseman, I don't think his production ceiling will be any higher than 45 points or along those lines. I think that he's a player that has a lot more room to grow in offensive transition and in being a facilitator in the offensive zone than he does as an actual dynamic force. Offensively, he's not a player that's going to be pinching and creating and using his handling to pierce through defensive structures and access the slot at even strength.
Yeah.
He's really going to be focused on getting the puck to more dangerous areas, using his passing game, and I think that will cap out as a 40 to 45 point offensive ceiling if he does get those top pairing minutes with perhaps second power play usage.
Yeah.
But where do you stand with the projection? Because the range between upside and floor with Silayev is one of the bigger ones in this draft class.
For sure. I think that's the main thing is, there's so many ranges of possibilities with Silayev. I think at the end of the day, you're definitely getting an NHLer. Very rarely do you see a 6'7" player with this level of skating ability not make it to the NHL. I think the
Yeah,
concern is mainly how much can you work on his mental game? How much can you make him a bona fide, high-end thinker of a game who can actually handle pressure well? I think that's the main concern. If the stars align perfectly, I think there's a future for Silayev as a number one 40 to 45 point defenseman who's mainly playing the defensive minutes on his team and just stop gapping everything. If you can pair him next to an offensive defenseman, I think that makes a great combination. But the question with Silayev is, can he do that? Because it's such a tall task, and we've seen it make players just crumble under pressure in the NHL in the NHL game. Like the NHL is a game pure pressure. You need not just in terms of physical pressure on the ice, but also the mental pressure of being a top five pick, of trying to make the NHL as being seen as the next big thing for your team, as the savior of a tanking organization. There's so much that goes into it. So for me, it's just I see a future for Salive as a second pair defenseman. I think that's mainly that's the most realistic and most likely outcome for me. And even then, it requires some work. And teams might like that in the top 5. Teams might like that at second overall. I think behind Macklin Celebrini, a lot of teams look at Silayev and salivate. Like, this is a type of player that doesn't come around all the time. We're pretty conservative with our usage of the word unicorn, but Silayev fits that to a T. Like I said, and like we discussed before the podcast, I don't think there's any NHLer who can cover as much ice in one stride as Silayev does. It's ridiculous. Like, I've seen him catch players on breakaways that were 5, 6 strides ahead of him. Like, he's got an
Yeah.
insane ability to close gaps. And if you can turn that into a cohesive toolkit by just fixing the mental game, then you're talking about a top pair defenseman. But like, that's because of how tall of a task that is, and how often I've seen defensemen not be able to turn that around. I'm a bit more skeptical. And I think that's why he ended up 12th overall on our board here at Dobber Prospects, right?
Precisely, yeah. Like, we have a lot of question marks. We've had a couple of viewings where various members of our team that have scouted Silayev have been like super enthusiastic, and I remember our early season viewings were quite literally the opposite. I remember both of us tearing out like individual strands of hair from having had to watch Silayev early on this season when the production was
Yep.
actually quite good, and there was some hype around him as an offensive defenseman, and we did not see that projection at
Yeah.
all. But yeah, no, he's a fascinating player, and I think whichever NHL team does end up drafting him will have quite the tall task in how they approach his development, because he is going to
Yeah.
need a lot of help. But if he gets the right type of help and is in the right type of environment throughout his development, the upside again is just so high. And as we, I think, have stated quite clearly, there are many a hurdle
Yeah.
between now and then. Uh, but with the right approach, there is definitely a path for Salaya to become a super unique and very valuable top pairing defenseman. But which NHL team do you think will most benefit from landing Silayev in that top 5 conversation? I think like the obvious bet here in terms of draft preferences would be the Arizona Coyotes, uh,
Yeah.
going back to back with Dmitry Simashev and and Anton Silayev would be quite the back to back draft hauls
Yeah.
in terms of big Russian left shot defensemen. But is there any other organization apart from Arizona that comes to mind for you?
For sure. For me, San Jose and Columbus are almost definitely taking a look at him, and both of them are in this range. I mean, San Jose is a second overall. Obviously, right now Arizona's on a 13 game losing streak, so they're climbing up the tank rankings, right? And
Rocketing up.
it's yeah, no, absolutely. And if they get into the top 3, and the team in front of him that isn't picking first overall goes for another player, I can almost guarantee you that Silayev is gone by then. I think anywhere Arizona picks is the floor for Silayev in terms of where he gets picked. Like, they're not letting him pass them. Um, but yeah, other than that, San Jose does need a left shot defenseman. They have Shakir Mohammedullin, but I'm not the biggest fan of his game, and I don't think he's necessarily been developing the way that he could be. And I think that overall, the Sharks are probably looking to bolster the left hand side, and if anyone's going to do that for them, it's Anton Silayev. And Columbus is a bit in the same book, and I think that pairing Anton Silayev and David Jiricek together for the next decade and a half, it seems pretty fun from an outside perspective. So those would be the two teams that I would kind of identify as the teams that could benefit from him. I'm not sure they go for him, but what's for sure is wherever Arizona's picking is the last pick alive is going to be available for sure.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. The Coyotes have certainly made it very clear that they love their big boys and they
Yeah,
will reach on big boys. And they did so last year with two very big Russian players inside the top 12, with Simashev at 6 and Daniil Boot at 11 or 12.
I think it was 12. Yeah,
With 12, yeah, very high picks for very big Russians. And Salayev is an even bigger Russian than those two. So straight up
yeah.
their alley.
No, absolutely. It's absurd. But yeah, that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, please leave us a rate and review and make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on around sports. And make sure to tune in for our next show as we continue our prospects coverage for the month of March. This has been Hattie Kalakesh with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.